Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. This season, I will be narrating for you the young adult romance Blemished Beauty by Brenda Hodnett, which, by the way, you can buy the printed copy of on Amazon. And today I will be sharing with you chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Blemished Beauty. And the reason I will be sharing 3 chapters today is simply because they are short. So, happy day. Here we go. Chapter 7, Snake Charmer. Tom was throwing darts at his dartboard. Daphne, who was sitting behind him in her new favorite chair, looked up from her sketches to watch. Each one of the darts pelted the red center. "You're really good at that," Daphne noted. "I get lots of practice when the weather is bad and I'm tired of working in the woodshop." "Oh yeah, I saw that in the attic," Daphne remembered. "I'm sorry you had to clean up all that mess with the snow," Tom said, tossing another dart. "Bullseye!" "You made all the furniture in this cabin, didn't you?" Tom turned around to face her. "Yeah, with the help of my pa." "I thought so. The craftsmanship is far too intricate and unique to be from a department store." "It's all very beautiful, Tom," Daphne said, looking down at her hands. A grin split Tom's face. "Do you want to come see what I'm working on now?" he asked. "I would love to," Daphne exclaimed. She uncrossed her legs and set her sketchbook down on the coffee table. Tom placed the darts in his hand into a small box next to her sketchbook and continued to grin. "Perfect. Follow me." Daphne followed Tom to the mudroom, where Tom grabbed the hanging rope that opened the hatch and retractable stairs. He climbed up and pushed open the heavy door. Daphne climbed up after him. Once she reached the top, Tom held out a hand to help her over the ledge. She tried to ignore the way her heart sped up a bit at his touch. "What do you think?" Tom asked. Daphne glanced all around her. She saw 2 tables with strips of boards across one of them, and a large saw on top of the other. Handmade shelves full of every kind of tool imaginable covered the walls. A few random small furniture items were scattered on the floor. Tom must have fixed the window he had broken into, because there was only one, and it was intact. Then she spotted something she liked very much, standing in the corner. "Oh, is this it?" she asked, walking over to a half-finished dresser. "Yes," answered Tom. "It's mahogany. Do you like it?" "What's not to like?" Daphne ran her fingertips over the maroon drawers. "How in the world did you carve these flowers into it?" Tom walked over to where she was and stood behind her. "I used a small tool," he said simply, "and a lot of patience." "I would say so. Looks like you were also quite an artist." Daphne turned to face him with a smile. Tom grinned back, and his face turned ruddy. "I've never been called that before." "Well, it's true," Daphne affirmed, as she ran her fingertips over the engraved petals. "Who is it for?" "Mama," Tom said. "I wish—" "You wish what?" asked Daphne, turning to face him again. Tom shrugged. "I wish my pa would have been able to see it." "I'm sure he sees it now," Daphne pointed out. Tom gave her a thoughtful smile and nodded. "Speaking of artists, have you ever entered your work in some kind of contest?" he wondered. Daphne shook her head. "No, I only have time for homework and my part-time job. In high school I was on the swim team, so—" "Really? You were on the swim team?" Daphne nodded. "All 4 years. Tom gazed at her with a strange admiration in his eyes. "That's right. You told me you took 2nd place in a meet. That's incredible." Daphne blushed at his praise. Thanks." Tom smiled broadly at her for a long minute with a twinkle in his eye before he cleared his throat. "Well, would you like me to show you how to make something or carve something?" "Yes, I would love that," Daphne exclaimed, suddenly excited. Tom gave her a scrutinizing look. "Really?" "Of course. Does that surprise you?" Tom smiled and raked a hand through his hair. "Yes, it does, actually. Nobody has ever wanted to before." "Well, it's a good thing you're stuck here with me then, isn't it?" Daphne asked with a grin. "Absolutely," Tom said. "Absolutely." "I did it! Tom, come look at this! I finished!" Tom set his tools and rushed over to where Daphne sat cross-legged on the floor, next to the stool she had been carving. "A snake, huh?" Tom murmured as he crouched to look at the engraving more closely. Well, I couldn't figure out what else would fit on the legs. Don't you like it? Daphne, it's gorgeous. I've never seen a better-looking snake. Of course I like it. A blushing smile crossed Daphne's face. Well, it should be. It took me 6 entire days to do it. Have we really been coming up here every day for a week? Tom questioned. Daphne nodded. While you've completed a dresser and a bench, I've only carved 1 snake. Tom placed a hand on her shoulder. It's a beautiful one. And guess what? He asked, looking at his watch. It's 9. I've got to go to bed so I can go on a hunt in the morning, now that I can get out of the cabin. My eyes could use a rest as well, Daphne agreed. Tom switched off their lantern. The 2 of them stood up and sauntered their way over to the ladder and descended. Downstairs was completely dark, except for the tiniest glow from a dying ember in the other room. Surprisingly, Daphne felt Tom whisper in her ear. I've had a great week with you, Daphne. She shivered at his closeness. Me too, Tom. Good night, he whispered again. Good night, she replied. In an instant, he was gone from her side. Chapter 8. Flying Blind. Daphne? Hey, Daphne, come here, Tom called from the front door. He sounded urgent, so Daphne quickly put down her sketchbook and scurried to the sound of his voice. She had just turned the corner into the entryway when Tom shouted again. Daphne! She jumped in surprise and then immediately froze in place at the shocking sight of Tom. Blood smothered his entire coat and pants. There was even blood splattered on his chin. Good night, Daphne. What's wrong? Tom asked her, looking at her with alarm. What happened to you? Daphne whispered, her eyes fixated on his bloody neck. Oh, honey, I'm fine. I was just carrying a caribou I killed. That's what I wanted to show you. Tom was not a walking corpse, then. Daphne sighed heavily with relief. She noticed his expression now and saw he was smiling kindly at her. Daphne inhaled deeply. Honey? She questioned, raising her eyebrows. Tom suddenly looked embarrassed. Sorry. That just slipped out wrong, he explained, shaking his head. Well, do you want to see him? See who? The caribou. Come on. He's just outside. Tom grabbed Daphne's hand and led her up the stairs and out the door. He turned his headlamp on so Daphne could see the animal in the dark. And there it was, a gigantic, bloody caribou with horns 3 times the size of its head. Wow! Exclaimed Daphne in total awe. He is massive! Tom beamed brightly at her. He's a beauty. How did you carry him so far? Daphne questioned. Well, that's the other thing I wanted to show you. Look. Tom pointed his finger and turned his headlamp in another direction. Daphne squinted a moment before she could make out the new shape. You found your snowmobile, she cried happily. Tom laughed a bit. Yes, I did. Oh, what good news! Daphne turned to Tom and saw his expression was more excited than she had seen him. He clapped his hands together once. Tell you what, Daphne, why don't I put this lovely beast in a safe place? Then I'll get out of this bloody mess and you and I can go on a little adventure. Oh, what kind of adventure? Daphne was curious. Tom shrugged. How about a snowmobile ride? In the dark. Tom nodded eagerly. It makes it all the more exhilarating. Daphne felt a sudden thrill rise within her. This was just what she needed. Tom looked pleased at her excitement. I hoped you would approve. Honey, he added with a wry smile. Daphne smacked his bloody chest, but Tom just laughed. Sorry, I couldn't help it. I'll take care of the beast, he declared. You don't have to, pull it apart and package it? I'll do that later, he murmured. I have plenty of time to myself with all the drawing you do. Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't an accusation, Daphne, Tom said kindly. Now get on something warm. Although it was 1 p.m., it was still fairly dark outside, and Daphne found herself clinging to Tom with all her might as they sped way too fast on Tom's snowmobile. Daphne tried to peer around his thick arms so she could see the narrow path lighted by the single headlight. She felt a little safer this way. Tom moved his arms in and out so much while steering it was difficult for Daphne to see much of anything. Instead, she rested her head on his back and watched, wide-eyed, as passing trees suddenly came into view and disappeared just as quickly. The cold air lashed at her ears, threatening to slice through her woolen hat. Occasionally, a branch or a bush would whip within an inch of her face, without her even realizing it was there in the first place. Going so fast and seeing very little in the dark, Daphne felt she were part of the wind itself. "We're almost there, Daphne," Tom called to her over his shoulder. "Almost where?" she called back to him. "The jumps," he yelled into the wind. "The what?" Before Daphne could finish, they were suddenly airborne. Daphne let out a high-pitched cry before they landed hard and sped along again. Daphne laughed out loud at the thrill of it, and then they were in the air once more. Although Daphne couldn't see, she could feel they were higher off the ground this time. Daphne's breath seemed to leave her lungs altogether and then abruptly push back inside her when they hurtled to the ground. Daphne couldn't anticipate when the jumps were coming, or how high they would be, or how they would hit the ground. It was all terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Daphne couldn't stop her excited cries of fear or her constant gasping laughter. She could hear Tom laughing heartily as well. After one particularly high jump, Daphne felt them hit the ground a little lopsided. The two of them were thrown from the snowmobile onto the freezing snowy earth. Daphne rolled a little ways before she was able to stop herself. For a long moment she just lay on her back, trying to catch her breath. "Daphne?" she heard Tom call loudly. He couldn't have been more than an arm's length away. "I'm right here," she answered. Tom reached out and touched her arm. "Are you hurt?" "That was so awesome, Tom," she laughed breathlessly. "Oh, my lands! I have never been so terrified in my life," she laughed out loud again. Daphne saw Tom's figure kneeling over her now. "You're not hurt?" he asked again. Daphne shook her head against the snow and continued to laugh, although her sides ached from the excitement and cold. Tom was laughing now, too, and collapsed beside her on his back. "Oh, I loved that, Daphne," he laughed. "I loved hearing you scream like a—" And then Tom let out another burst of laughter. "Like a what?" Daphne chuckled back at him, trying to see his face in the dark. "Like a praying eagle. Ah! Ah!" He tried to mimic her by making a ridiculous, obnoxious, high-pitched bird call. "I did not," Daphne protested through her laughter. Instead of responding, Tom just laughed harder than Daphne had ever heard him laugh before. Daphne tried to protest again, but all she could do was laugh hysterically. Tom held his stomach as if it hurt. The two laughed and gasped in the cold air for another long minute. "How are we ever going to find your snowmobile?" Daphne asked, once their chuckles had subdued. "Oh, I'm sure it's not too far. We're in a cove right now. And," he said, lifting a finger, "I have a flashlight." They both sat up on their knees as Daphne saw a small stream of light appear on the white ground. "Look, there it is." Daphne followed the stream of light to the abandoned snowmobile, resting with its front skis buried in the snowy powder. Tom then brought the light back so it was shining between them. Daphne could see Tom clearly now. His black face mask was nearly covered with snow. His russet eyes stared back at her, and Daphne found she couldn't look away. "I can't believe how green your eyes are," Tom said. "They're really pretty, Daphne." Daphne gulped, feeling like her tongue was now frozen along with the rest of her. Tom finally broke the moment. "Let's get going," he said. He stood, then extended a hand to her. Chapter 9. Brewing Desires. "This is great, Daphne," announced Tom. "You implied earlier that you weren't a very good cook." "I'm not," she said. Tom held his fork full of enchiladas up to his mouth. "This dish clearly proves otherwise," he disputed before taking a bite. Daphne was standing opposite of Tom with her hands on the edge of the counter. "It's the only thing I can make. I would love for you to teach me some of your tricks." Tom swallowed his mouthful of food. "Well, that sounds great. After dinner, let's make caramel popcorn." Daphne's face lit up. Tom loved that look. After they stuffed themselves to the brim, Tom began his cooking lessons that, for some reason, he was ecstatic about. Perhaps it was because Daphne was such a smart pupil. "All right, the popcorn is popped. Now we come to the tricky part. First, melt the butter in the pan and put the rest of the ingredients in. Make sure you constantly stir so nothing scorches." Daphne nodded, and Tom watched her as she followed his directions. She took a long time measuring the cups of sugar, so Tom assisted her by stirring the butter in the pot. "Oh, sorry you have to do that. I've never done this before." "No worries. We're doing this together," Tom placated. When Daphne resumed stirring, Tom said, "All right, now we want to boil it to death." "Okay," said Daphne with a grin. "Where did you learn how to cook?" she asked, still looking at the caramel liquid. Tom was leaning one hip against the counter, facing Daphne. "Trial and error, I guess," he speculated. "Kind of like life." "I doubt your life has been too full of error," Daphne assumed. Tom laughed at that. "You don't know me very well, Daphne." "I know you love your family," Daphne noted. "It would be senseless not to," Tom replied. "I also know you have a good enough heart to take care of a stranger in need, even to the point of spending a ridiculous amount of money on her." "But that doesn't make up for other stuff." "Like what?" Daphne asked, looking at him curiously while her spoon still moved round and round. Tom took a deep breath. "Never mind. Besides, no matter how good you think I am, I don't even compare to you." Daphne rolled her eyes. "I'm no better than you are, Tom," she assured him. "We went over this when I first arrived, remember?" "You are, Daphne. I can sense it in you by the way you talk, and how thoughtful you are. You know, most people in your place would take advantage of the situation and milk it for all it's worth. But you do everything you can to give back. It's not normal." Daphne smiled and blushed for some reason. "Well, I will be the first to agree I'm not normal. But I think you're wrong about the general world. Most people do want to give back." Tom laughed lightly again. "You just proved my point once more, Daphne. You naturally think better of people than I do." Daphne shrugged. "I suppose if you want to think badly about yourself, then you can," she told him, turning her eyes back to the caramel that was starting a rolling boil. Tom chuckled. For no reason at all, he suddenly felt a stirring feeling for Daphne. Was it just gratitude? "Daphne?" Tom hesitated. Daphne turned her head to look at him. He inhaled a nervous breath. "You've done more for me than anyone has in a long, long time. I don't know, you're just so..." Tom had no idea what his expression looked like, but Daphne stopped stirring and just stared at him. A deep rosy color touched her cheeks. Tom lifted a hand to stroke her hair, but before he could, Daphne flinched and quickly shifted her gaze back to the caramel. What am I doing anyway? Surely this crazy feeling for Daphne that had come over him must be because he'd been so emotional since Pa had died. Then again, Daphne was different somehow. How grateful he was she had not pushed him into disclosing why he wasn't that great of a guy. Tanya wouldn't have done that. Even in the beginning, she would have harped on the issue so hard it would have driven him mad. As a matter of fact, she did. But Daphne was observant and respectful. He was thinking about Daphne again. What is wrong with me? Do I have feelings for her? It seemed nearly impossible, yet there they were, right inside of him. His emotions had never been so whacked and messed up. He would have to get rid of them. "Okay, has it boiled long enough?" Daphne asked. Tom abruptly came out of his reverie. "Oh, let's check its temperature." Tom pulled out a candy thermometer and stuck it into the boiling liquid. "Yep, it's perfect. Let's pour it on the popcorn now." Daphne brought over the bowl of popcorn, and Tom dumped the caramel into it, while Daphne stirred the popcorn around to coat it evenly. While Tom was snitching and burning his fingers, Daphne was already washing dirty dishes. "Oh, no, you cook dinner, I'll do the dishes," Tom offered. Daphne smiled at him. "I like that rule, but I don't mind helping." Tom took hold of her shoulders and gently pulled her away from the sink. "You've done enough today, Daphne. I'll finish." "Okay, if you insist," she agreed with a laugh in her voice. Tom resumed washing silverware as he watched Daphne take a seat in the recliner by the fire. She stretched her legs onto the ottoman and grabbed a notebook sitting on the end table next to it. She did have nice long legs. "Oh, good night." Tom sighed and turned toward the sink, reminding himself that he wasn't interested in Daphne. "What are you drawing now?" Tom called. "Oh, I'm actually writing. I hope you don't mind. I borrowed 2 of your notebooks. I'll pay you back for them." What is it with her and wanting so much to pay me back for every little thing? "Daphne, it's just a notebook." "What are you writing?" It's a journal." "Huh. Is she writing about me?" "Of course she is. She's probably writing about that bozo move I just made." He decided he would let her be so she could write about how stupid he was. Once the pans were clean, Tom turned in Daphne's direction once again. "Ready for popcorn? I bet it's cool enough now." "Absolutely," Daphne cried, getting up from her chair. "How about an old Western movie to go with it?" Tom suggested. Daphne looked at him in surprise. "Well, sure. I love Westerns." "Yeah? Okay then, let's make a date of it." Tom swallowed. "What did I just say?" Daphne didn't give him any hint it was out of the ordinary, so he let it go. Tom turned on the movie. The 2 of them immediately sat down and began eating the delicious caramel popcorn eagerly. "This stuff is amazing," Daphne announced in between bites. "I know. Nice job, Chef," Tom replied. Daphne gave him a sideways glance. "It's because of you, not me. We really should make this every night." "I agree," Tom said. "Tomorrow we'll do it again." Tom was already excited about it. He was also excited to be here with Daphne. He was losing it, simply losing it. The popcorn disappeared quickly, and Tom and Daphne were now quietly watching a gunfight. This is very romantic," Tom said sarcastically. Daphne nodded. "Extremely." "Well, in that case," he declared, and without any prior contemplation, Tom watched his arm lift up and over and around Daphne. It was as if some invisible hand had moved it. His heart was beating with adrenaline and confusion. He had to stop this insanity of his. But Daphne leaned her head against his shoulder, and it felt too good to stop. So he didn't. And that concludes Chapter 9. It's getting exciting! I hope you liked it. Next week, we will read Chapter 10, which is called About Face. So, I hope you join me next time. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.